Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video. Today, we're going to be looking at one of the more famous battles of the Crusades. Now, that could be considered as many battles, such as the Battle of Hattin or the Battle of Montigid. However, this one was made quite famous through the film Kingdom of Heaven, and that would be the 1187 Siege of Jerusalem by Saladin versus Balian of Ibelin. But what really happened? Well, following the Battle of Hattin on the 4th of July 1187, almost all of the Kingdom of Jerusalem soldiers and nobility were captured and executed, or they were sent to slave markets in Damascus, where the sheer number of slaves there crashed the market. Now, those, of course, did not include the Knights Templar and Hospitaller, who were specifically executed under Saladin's orders, as he took great offence at them. Now, Balian of Ibelin, unlike the film, was not actually at Jerusalem during the time of the battle. He was in Tyre, which was one of the only few remaining settlements and cities that Saladin had not captured before the battle. Now, he asked Saladin whether he'd be allowed to actually go to Jerusalem to fetch his family. Saladin agreed to this and allowed him to go to Jerusalem. However, he made sure that it would be that under the terms that Balian would not take up arms against him. However, when he arrived, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Heraclius, and also the people of Jerusalem and Queen Sibylla begged him to stay and defend the city. Heraclius then offered to absolve him of his oath, which was essentially make it so that God did not see him that he was committing a sin for breaking it. Now, Balian agreed to this. Despite the treachery, however, Saladin still allowed his wife and child to leave the city to Tripoli, which was again not under Muslim control at the time. This, of course, would then allow his family to leave. Now, when Balian began to prepare, he found the situation was quite dire. There were fewer than 14 knights, so he then made 60 more from squires, who were knights in training, and freemen, so just basically peasants, who no longer had a lord to serve, most likely because they had been killed. Now, he also stockpiled food and water, as of course those are important aspects to the siege, and food would be especially hard to get by in the arid climate of the Middle East. Now, Saladin's forces then arrived at the city on September 20th, 1187, thus marking the beginning of the siege. Now, Saladin initially concentrated his forces around the Tower of David and the Damascus Gate, and for 6 days Saladin pushed the siege towers, which are essentially the large towers you see in the film, which would be filled with troops. He pushed them forward each day, but they failed to take the walls every time. And each time he did this, Saladin faced devastating casualties from such small numbers. This is, of course, due to the nature of sieges being that they are quite in concentrated zones, making it essentially what would be defined in modern terms as a killing zone. So, following this great defeat, essentially, due to the fact that the Gate of Damascus was there, meaning that the Crusader forces could also ride out and skirmish with the Muslim forces holding them back. So on September 26th, Saladin moved his forces to the Mount of Olives, where there was no gate, meaning the Crusaders could not mount a counterattack. Now, the Mount of Olives had been used multiple times to besiege Jerusalem, most famously when the Romans besieged Jerusalem in the Jewish revolt. Now, Saladin used catapults, mangonels, which were like trebuchets but pulled by hand. He also used trebuchets, crossbows, and Greek fire. Now, the recipe for Greek fire has been lost, but it's essentially an ancient version of napalm. It's called Greek fire due to the fact that it was initially invented by the Byzantine Empire and used against Turkish navies. Now, obviously, the knowledge of Greek fire being used at the battle is a bit sort of hit or miss, so take it with a grain of salt in that case. Most of the things about these ancient battles, again, are very much hit and miss. The estimated force that Saladin had was 20,000, but we're not that certain. He also had sappers dig tunnels under the walls to collapse them, which he achieved on September 29th, creating a gap for his forces to go through. Now, sappers were quite an important role in medieval Europe, and also, obviously, medieval Middle East. They essentially made quick work of a wall because they would simply dig under it, support the weight of the wall using wooden struts, then set fire to it, collapsing the earth beneath it, and hopefully collapsing the wall. It was incredibly dangerous and didn't always work, however. And another famous example is during the Siege of Constantinople in 1453, a Scottish man, of all people, who was a siege expert in Constantinople at the time, noticed the Serbian sappers digging under the walls and poured hot tar on them, along with the Byzantines. Now, one way you could tell was by putting buckets of water on the ground. If you noticed vibrations in the water, it meant they were digging under you. Now, sappers and siege warfare like that style has continued all the way to modern day, and another famous example being World War I, where they, of course, dig tunnels under German trenches and blew them up. Now, although the Crusaders did suffer a major problem in the sense that there was now a hole in their impenetrable wall, it was not the biggest problem for them, as in fact Saladin's men could not actually break through the gap, as of course being a relatively small gap, the Crusaders were able to block it with rubble and men, essentially, making it almost impossible for Saladin's men to get through, where they again suffered many casualties. But the Crusader forces were eventually spent, and although there were still hundreds of thousands of refugees within the city who could be called upon and also take up arms, they chose not to as they feared death, and of course, no matter how much the Crusaders offered to pay them, they just generally refused to take up arms. Now, due to the hopelessness of the situation, the clergy organised a barefoot procession around the walls. This is something that the clergy often did in siege situations where they were losing, as it was obviously to them a sign of God's wrath against them for being arrogant or committing sin. And as Ernal, who was squire to Balian, described it as, "Our Lord did not deign to hear the prayers or the noise that was made in the city, for the stench of adultery, of disgusting extravagance, and of sin against nature would not let their prayers rise to God." And that's just an example of how religious it was during this time. Now, by the end of September, Balian met with Saladin to discuss terms. However, Saladin demanded unconditional surrender, which was essentially that he could just walk into the city and the Crusaders would lay down their arms and he could do whatever he wanted to them. However, Balian told Saladin that he would destroy all the Muslim holy sites, slaughter their own families and themselves, and the 5,000 Muslim slaves that were within the city. Now, Saladin, he wanted to avoid more bloodshed, as of course the battle had suffered enough of it already. So he still wanted unconditional surrender. However, he said that each man would have to pay. He offered to have each man pay 10 dinars, which is the Muslim currency at the time, not marks. So they paid with dinars, obviously currency differences. For a man to leave, a woman would pay 5 dinars and a child 2. However, those who could not pay would be enslaved. Balian, however, knew that 20,000 crusaders within the city would not be able to pay. So eventually, after a lot of negotiations, it came down that 7,000 would get to leave after the city paid 30,000 dinars. Now, this, of course, like in the previous video when talking about Constantinople and its sacking, resulted in many historical things like gold crosses being melted down and forged into coins as quickly as possible, or just handed over in order to pay. And on October 2nd, the city surrendered to Saladin and the siege ended, marking a relatively quick siege considering that Jerusalem was a heavily defended city with 3 major walls. However, of course, you've got to remember that there were 20,000 Muslim soldiers and only around less than 100 knights and a few hundred men-at-arms. However, one of the biggest problems was that, of course, messages were quite slow at the time, and although 3 columns were divided of the people who were allowed out the city and guarded by Saladin's soldiers, some chose to lead their own way, and a lot of Saladin's soldiers who were in the rest of the Middle East and across the Crusader states that were conquered were not aware of this order, so in fact enslaved them. So there are multiple examples of people being allowed out of the city, making it nearly to Crusader territory, and then being enslaved again. Now, overall, the siege was of epic proportions. I mean, 20,000 Muslim soldiers, some of the cream of the crop of Saladin's own men, fought less than 100 knights, and they won, yes, but at such a costly proportion. I mean, frankly speaking, it is quite amazing. So does Kingdom of Heaven really do it justice? Well, to some degrees it does. It does obviously show the wall going down, however, it doesn't show Saladin moving positions. It shows him going after a gate, which of course we know he didn't. He actually just brought down the walls using sappers. However, Ridley Scott, in his usual way of showing historical films, chose to do it in his own way, which was exciting. Thankfully, not as disastrous as the Napoleon movie. So the siege was quite impressive compared to other sieges of the time. However, once again, like I said about Baldwin IV, overall what happened in the Middle East and the Crusader states in terms of how sieges were done were never truly as impressive than what was going on in Europe, or perhaps even later on, as we can look in another video, what was happening in China and Japan and Korea with the Mongols. And this is just due to the fact that, of course, there were very long supply lines. Not many people would go there in terms of Christians, of course, because, why leave home? It's expensive, it's dangerous. But yeah, it's quite an interesting, topic to look at. Quite a hard one to do in 10 minutes, but we try. So thank you all for watching.